My wife's genetic screening for cancer risk revealed our twins were conceived a week apart with different fathers. The genetic counselor looked at me across her desk and said the words that would destroy everything. Mr. Garrett, the test results show that your twin daughters have different biological fathers. I sat there holding Vanessa's hand, the hand I'd held for 10 years of marriage, and watched my wife's face turn pale as Dr. Patricia Nguyen explained that Maya and Sophie, our 5-year-old twin daughters, shared only 50% of their DNA instead of the expected amount for fraternal twins conceived simultaneously. This is called heteropaternal superfecundation, Dr. Nguyen continued in that clinical voice doctors use when delivering devastating news. It occurs when a woman releases multiple eggs during ovulation and has intercourse with different partners within a short window, typically 5 to 7 days. Each egg is fertilized by sperm from a different man. She pulled up genetic charts on her tablet showing paternal markers that didn't match between our daughters. One of your twins shares your genetic markers, Mr. Garrett. The other does not. The evidence is conclusive. Vanessa made a choking sound beside me. I turned to look at my wife, the woman I'd trusted completely, the mother of my children, and saw genuine shock on her face that looked too real to be performance. But the science didn't lie. Somewhere during the week we'd conceived our daughters, Vanessa had been with another man. Dr. Nguyen was still talking, explaining medical implications and offering counseling resources, but I couldn't hear her over the rushing sound in my ears. I'd come to this appointment thinking we'd discuss Vanessa's cancer risk, maybe schedule preventative surgeries, plan for a future where we fought disease together. Instead, I'd learned that my family was built on a lie, that one of the little girls I'd raised from birth, changed diapers for, read bedtime stories to, wasn't actually mine. Which one? I asked, interrupting whatever Dr. Nguyen was saying. Which daughter isn't mine? Vanessa grabbed my arm. David, don't, please. They're both yours. You've raised them both. Biology doesn't matter. Dr. Nguyen looked uncomfortable. We don't typically disclose that information without careful consideration and counseling. These situations require sensitivity regarding the children's well-being. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need to know which of my daughters belongs to another man. Right now. Dr. Nguyen exchanged a look with Vanessa, and that look told me everything. They both knew. Vanessa already knew which twin wasn't mine, which meant she'd known all along who the other father was, had known for 5 years and said nothing. Sophie, Vanessa whispered. Sophie isn't yours biologically. Sophie, my baby girl with the dimples and the gap between her front teeth, who called me daddy and climbed into my lap every morning asking for pancakes. Sophie, who looked exactly like Vanessa's mother in old photographs, who had Vanessa's laugh and Vanessa's stubborn streak. Sophie wasn't mine. I walked out of the office without another word, heard Vanessa calling after me, heard Dr. Nguyen saying something about waiting and discussing next steps. I made it to my car before I threw up in the parking lot, my hands braced against the hood, my body rejecting the information my brain was trying to process. Vanessa caught up to me, her hand on my back, trying to comfort me the way she'd comforted me through my father's death and my sister's cancer diagnosis. But this time, her touch felt like poison. David, please, let me explain, she said. I need to tell you what happened in Denver. I straightened up and looked at her. You were with someone else. That's what happened. You slept with another man and got pregnant with his child and let me believe she was mine for 5 years. Vanessa was crying, mascara running down her cheeks. It wasn't like that. I was assaulted, David. I didn't consent. I didn't even remember it happening until months later. The assault claim hit me like a second bomb. If she was telling the truth, if she'd been assaulted, that changed everything about how I should be feeling and reacting. But if she was lying, if this was a story she'd constructed to avoid responsibility, that was a different kind of betrayal. Tell me exactly what happened, I said, my voice flat. Vanessa leaned against my car, her whole body shaking. 6 years ago, the pharmaceutical conference in Denver. The last night there was a reception with an open bar. I had too much wine. Too much. I remember talking to colleagues, remember the room spinning, and then nothing. I woke up the next morning in a hotel room I didn't recognize, in bed with a man I'd never seen before. I was naked. I had bruises on my thighs and arms. I knew something had happened, but I couldn't remember any of it. She wrapped her arms around herself. I left before he woke up. I was so ashamed, David. I blamed myself for drinking too much, for being careless. I took a shower that lasted an hour. I took Plan B the next day. Then I came home to you and tried to forget it happened. She looked at me with desperate eyes. When I got pregnant 2 weeks later, I thought the Plan B had failed, that the baby was from the assault. But then the doctor said it was twins, and I did the math. We'd been together so much that week after I got home. I convinced myself both babies were yours, that the Plan B had worked, that the assault hadn't resulted in pregnancy. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think my wife was a victim rather than a cheater, but something didn't add up. You never reported it? Never went to the hospital? Never told anyone? Vanessa shook her head. I was ashamed. I thought it was my fault for drinking. I didn't want to be that woman, didn't want people to look at me differently, and I didn't remember enough to report anyway. I didn't know his name, didn't know what room I'd been in, couldn't describe what happened. What would I have reported? I thought about that conference, about the timing. Vanessa had come home Sunday afternoon. We had intercourse that night, and every night that week. If she'd been assaulted Friday night in Denver, and we'd conceived both Maya and Sophie during that week, the genetic evidence made sense. 2 eggs, 2 different fathers, one from assault and one from consensual sex with me. It was biologically possible, but it was also possible she'd had an affair and was now claiming assault to avoid consequences. Who was he? I asked. The man in Denver. Did you ever find out his name? Vanessa nodded slowly. After I found out I was pregnant with twins, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I went back through the conference materials, looked at attendee lists, tried to remember any details. I thought I'd seen him at the reception, thought maybe I'd talked to him earlier in the conference. I found photos from the event on the conference website. I recognized him in one of the pictures. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and showed me a photo. It was a group shot from the conference, pharmaceutical reps and doctors clustered together holding wine glasses, everyone smiling. Vanessa pointed to a man in the back, tall with dark hair and a corporate smile. That's him, I'm almost certain. His name was Richard Kelso. He was a regional director for one of the competing pharmaceutical companies. I looked at the man in the photo, the man who'd fathered Sophie, the man who'd either raped my wife or had an affair with her depending on whose version was true. He looked ordinary, professional, like any of 1,000 business executives. Did you ever contact him? Tell him about Sophie? Vanessa shook her head. No, I convinced myself both girls were yours. I didn't want to know otherwise. I didn't want to open that door. I looked at my wife standing there crying in a medical building parking lot and realized I didn't know if she was telling the truth. I didn't know if Sophie was the product of assault or affair. I didn't know if I was married to a victim or a liar. I need time, I said. I need to process this. Vanessa reached for me. David, please, we can work through this. The girls need us both. Sophie is your daughter in every way that matters. You've been her father since birth. Nothing changes that. Everything changed that. The genetic test had revealed a truth that rewrote our entire family history. I got in my car and drove, not home, but to my brother's house across town. Julian was 2 years younger than me, worked as a defense attorney, and had the kind of cynical perspective I needed right now. I showed up at his door unannounced and told him everything while sitting at his kitchen table. He listened without interrupting, his lawyer face on, and when I finished, he asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do you believe her? About the assault? I put my head in my hands. I don't know. Part of me wants to believe her because the alternative is that she cheated and lied for 5 years. But part of me wonders if she's lying now to avoid consequences. How do I know? Julian tapped his fingers on the table. You investigate. You find Richard Kelso and you ask him what happened that night. You look at evidence. You talk to people who were there. You gather facts. He leaned forward. David, if she was assaulted, she's a victim, and she needs your support. But if she had an affair and is now claiming assault to cover it up, that's a different situation entirely. You need to know the truth before you make any decisions about your marriage or how you feel about Sophie. I spent the next 3 days investigating while Vanessa stayed at her sister's house with the girls. I told Maya and Sophie that Mommy and Daddy needed some time to work on grown-up things, and they accepted it with the resilience of children who believed their parents would fix everything. I contacted Richard Kelso through his company LinkedIn page, sent him a message asking to speak about the Denver conference 6 years ago. He responded within hours, his message friendly and curious. We arranged a video call for that evening. When his face appeared on my laptop screen, I recognized him from the conference photo. Older now, but clearly the same man. "Mr. Garrett, what can I do for you?" he asked, professional and polite. I decided on directness. 6 years ago, you attended a pharmaceutical conference in Denver. So did my wife, Vanessa Garrett. Do you remember her? Richard's expression changed slightly, confusion giving way to recognition. Vanessa? Yes, I remember her. We talked at the reception the last night. Why are you asking? I felt my stomach clench. What happened between you two that night? Richard looked genuinely puzzled. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about industry trends. She seemed nice. Then she said she wasn't feeling well and left. That was it. I didn't see her again. Why? His confusion seemed authentic, but I needed to be certain. I showed him a photo of Vanessa on my phone, holding it up to the camera. This is my wife. You're sure this is the woman you talked to? Richard leaned closer to his screen. Yes, that's her. We talked at the bar. She had a few drinks, seemed fine at first, then said she felt dizzy and needed to go to her room. I offered to walk her, but she said she was okay. That was the last I saw of her. His concern looked genuine. Is she all right? Did something happen? I explained about the genetic test, about Sophie, about Vanessa's claim that she'd woken up in a hotel room with a man she didn't know. Richard's face went pale. Mr. Garrett, I did not have sex with your wife. I spoke with her briefly and that was all. If she woke up in someone's hotel room, it wasn't mine. I was sharing a room with a colleague from my company. He can verify I came back to our room around 11 that night and slept there. He looked disturbed. If something happened to her after she left the reception, I'm sorry. But it wasn't me. I believed him. His confusion and concern seemed authentic, and the timeline he described matched Vanessa's memory of talking to someone before everything went blank. Do you remember seeing anyone else paying attention to her that night? Anyone who might have followed her when she left? Richard thought for a moment. There was another guy at the bar, sitting a few seats down from us. He kept looking at Vanessa while we talked. When she said she wasn't feeling well and left, I noticed he left maybe a minute after her, heading the same direction. I didn't think anything of it at the time, just assumed he was leaving too. But now, he trailed off, the implication clear. I asked him to describe the man, and Richard gave me details. Medium height, sandy brown hair, maybe 40 years old, wearing a conference badge, but Richard hadn't caught the name. I might be able to find conference photos with him in them, Richard offered. The hosting organization posted hundreds of pictures. If you give me your email, I can send you any I find. I thanked him and ended the call, feeling worse than before. If Richard wasn't Sophie's father, then some other man at that conference was. Some man who'd potentially drugged and raped my wife, which meant Vanessa had been telling the truth about the assault, which meant I'd spent 3 days investigating her like she was a suspect instead of supporting her as a victim. I called Vanessa immediately. She answered on the first ring, her voice small and scared. David? I apologized, told her I believed her, that I'd spoken to Richard Kelso and he'd confirmed her account of that night, that another man had followed her when she left the reception. Told her I should have believed her from the start instead of treating her like a criminal. She cried with relief, and I cried with guilt for doubting her. The next week was spent trying to figure out what to do with this information. Vanessa wanted to report the assault to Denver police, even though it had happened 6 years ago, even though she barely remembered details. I supported her through the process of filing a report, talking to detectives, going through the trauma of recounting what little she remembered. The detective assigned to her case, a woman named Linda Foster, was sympathetic but realistic. Mrs. Garrett, I understand you want justice, but 6 years is a long time. The hotel records from that conference are gone. Security footage would have been deleted long ago. Without physical evidence or witnesses who saw something specific, there's not much we can investigate. She looked at the conference photo Richard had sent showing the man who'd left after Vanessa. This man could have been going to his own room. We have no evidence he did anything wrong. Vanessa asked about DNA testing, about using Sophie's genetics to identify her biological father from conference attendees. Detective Foster explained that would require getting DNA samples from potentially hundreds of men who attended that conference, and without probable cause, they couldn't compel anyone to submit DNA. I'm sorry, the detective said. I believe something happened to you, but proving it now, prosecuting it, finding the person responsible, it's not realistically possible without more evidence. Vanessa broke down after that call. She'd been holding on to hope that reporting the assault would lead somewhere, that the man who'd done this would face consequences. Instead, she got confirmation that he'd gotten away with it, that he'd raped her and fathered a child, and would never be held accountable. I held her while she cried and felt my own rage building. Some man had assaulted my wife, had gotten her pregnant, and was walking around free while we dealt with the aftermath. The question of what to do about Sophie loomed over everything. Legally, I was her father. My name was on her birth certificate. I'd raised her from birth. Biologically, she was the child of my wife and her rapist. Did that change how I felt about her? Could I look at Sophie now without seeing the assault? Without thinking about the man who'd done this? I went to see a therapist specializing in trauma and family dynamics. Dr. Michael Rosen listened to my situation and asked difficult questions. Do you love Sophie less now that you know she's not biologically yours? I thought about Sophie's laugh, her drawings that covered our refrigerator, the way she held my hand when we crossed streets. No, I said. I love her exactly the same. She's my daughter. Dr. Rosen nodded. Then biology doesn't define your relationship. You are her father in every meaningful way. The circumstances of her conception are tragic, but they don't change who she is, or who you are to her. He helped me understand that Sophie was innocent in all of this, that she deserved to be loved and protected regardless of how she was conceived. He also helped me process my anger at the man who'd assaulted Vanessa, anger I couldn't direct anywhere because we didn't know who he was. I went home that night and found Sophie playing with dolls in the living room. She looked up when I came in and smiled. Daddy, will you play with me? I sat down on the floor and played dolls with my daughter who shared no genetic connection to me but who was mine in every way that mattered. Vanessa and I slowly rebuilt our marriage after the revelation. It wasn't easy. She struggled with PTSD from the assault she'd finally allowed herself to acknowledge. She had nightmares, panic attacks, periods where she couldn't function. She started therapy, joined a support group for survivors, worked through the trauma she'd buried for 6 years. I struggled with my own feelings of helplessness and rage, with wanting to protect my family from something that had already happened, with the knowledge that Sophie's biological father was out there somewhere. We decided not to tell the girls yet. They were too young to understand, and telling Sophie that she was conceived through assault seemed cruel and unnecessary at this age. Maybe when they were older, when they asked questions about genetics and family history, we'd find ways to explain. But for now, they were just our daughters, both of them, equally loved. Richard Kelso stayed in touch, surprisingly. He felt guilty about not doing more that night, about not insisting on walking Vanessa to her room, about not noticing that something was wrong. He sent me enhanced versions of conference photos showing the man who'd followed Vanessa, helped me create a timeline of that evening based on what he remembered. We developed an unlikely friendship based on shared guilt and desire for justice that seemed impossible to achieve. 18 months after the genetic test revealed the truth, Richard called me with news. David, I think I found him, the man from the conference. My heart started racing. How? Richard explained that he'd been attending another industry conference and had seen someone he recognized. I wasn't sure at first, but then I heard him talking and something clicked. I checked the attendee list and found his name, Thomas Wyatt. He works for a medical device company, has been in the industry for 20 years. I started digging into his background, and David, there are rumors, other women from other conferences reporting similar experiences. Nothing official, nothing prosecuted, but whispers that he has a pattern of behavior. Richard sent me everything he'd compiled, photos of Thomas Wyatt from various conferences over the years, LinkedIn profile showing his career trajectory, and most damning, a private Facebook group where women in the pharmaceutical industry shared warnings about men to avoid at conferences. Thomas Wyatt's name appeared multiple times, always with similar stories: buying women drinks, being overly attentive, women not remembering the end of the evening, waking up confused and violated. I showed everything to Vanessa. She looked at Thomas Wyatt's photo for a long time, studying his face, and I saw recognition flash in her eyes, followed immediately by fear. That's him, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I remember seeing him at the bar. He bought me a drink when Richard went to the restroom. He was so friendly, so professional. I remember feeling strange after finishing that drink, Not just drunk, but wrong, like my body wasn't responding correctly. Her hands started shaking. He must have put something in it. I remember feeling dizzy, remember telling Richard I needed to leave, and then there's nothing, just blank space until I woke up in that room. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. After all this time, I finally know his name. We took everything to Detective Foster in Denver. She reviewed the materials Richard had compiled and made calls to women mentioned in that Facebook group. 3 women agreed to give formal statements about their experiences with Thomas Wyatt at various conferences over the past decade. Experiences that matched Vanessa's. Drinks that made them feel wrong, memory loss, waking up disoriented with physical evidence of assault. None had reported at the time because of shame, because of lack of evidence, because they thought no one would believe them. Detective Foster said she had enough for an interview, but not enough for an arrest warrant yet. She contacted Thomas Wyatt, requesting a voluntary interview. He agreed, claiming he had nothing to hide and was happy to clear up any misunderstandings. Vanessa and I weren't allowed to be present for the interview, but Detective Foster called us afterward with an update. He denied everything, said he didn't remember Vanessa specifically, said he attends dozens of conferences and talks to hundreds of people. He denied remembering any of the other women who gave statements. He was calm, professional, acted like this was all a terrible mistake. She paused. But when I mentioned we had genetic evidence connecting him to a child conceived during the Denver conference, his demeanor changed. He got nervous, started sweating, asked if he needed a lawyer. I told him he wasn't under arrest, but he was free to have legal representation if he wanted it. That reaction, that visible fear when confronted with genetic evidence, was enough for Detective Foster to pursue a warrant for Thomas Wyatt's DNA. He fought it through his lawyers, claimed harassment and false accusations, argued that agreeing to an interview shouldn't subject him to forced DNA collection. But the judge sided with law enforcement, noting the pattern of allegations from multiple women and the existence of genetic evidence suggesting he'd fathered a child during the time frame in question. They collected his DNA through the court order and compared it to Sophie's genetic profile. The results came back 3 weeks later, and Detective Foster called us with confirmation we'd been waiting for. Thomas Wyatt was Sophie's biological father. The match was conclusive. Probability of paternity 99.9%. Armed with DNA evidence linking him to Sophie and testimony from 4 women describing similar assaults, Detective Foster arrested Thomas Wyatt on multiple charges of sexual assault. The arrest made regional news within hours. Pharmaceutical industry websites picked up the story, detailing allegations against a longtime industry professional. And suddenly, women started coming forward with more allegations spanning 15 years. Thomas Wyatt had been drugging and assaulting women at industry conferences for over a decade, using his position and the transient nature of conferences to avoid consequences. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Jennifer Ortiz, was aggressive and thorough. She interviewed every woman who came forward, building a case that showed clear pattern and practice. She used Sophie's existence as proof that at least one assault had resulted in pregnancy, making the consequences of Wyatt's actions undeniable. The trial happened 10 months after his arrest. Vanessa testified, describing that night in Denver, the drink Thomas Wyatt had bought her, the strange feeling that had overwhelmed her, waking up in his hotel room. She described living with the trauma for 6 years, convinced she'd somehow been responsible for drinking too much, for being careless. She described the genetic test that had finally revealed the truth, that had given her daughter's conception a context she'd been trying to understand for years. 3 other women testified with similar stories, creating a narrative of systematic predation that was impossible to dismiss. Thomas Wyatt's defense attorney tried to suggest the encounters had been consensual, that these women had willingly gone to his room and were now reframing consensual sex as assault out of regret or for financial gain. But the pattern was too clear, the similarities too specific. The prosecution presented evidence that Thomas Wyatt had purchased Rohypnol, the date rape drug, multiple times over the years through online pharmacies. They showed his hotel room charges from various conferences, always booking rooms on the same floor where networking receptions were held, always near the elevators. They demonstrated that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a series of consensual encounters gone wrong. This was calculated predation by someone who'd refined his approach over many years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 4 counts of sexual assault, one for each woman who'd testified. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. During that time, Vanessa and I tried to process what this meant for our family. Justice had been served in the legal sense. The man who'd assaulted her, who'd fathered Sophie through violence, would face consequences. But what did that mean for Sophie? She was 6 now, still unaware that the man who'd just been convicted was her biological father, still calling me daddy without qualification or doubt. At the sentencing hearing, each victim was allowed to give an impact statement. Vanessa stood at the podium and spoke directly to Thomas Wyatt, who sat at the defense table avoiding eye contact. "You took something from me that night that I can never get back. You took my sense of safety, my ability to trust, my belief that I could control what happened to my own body. You also gave me something I never asked for, a daughter conceived through violence. But Sophie is innocent. She's beautiful and smart and funny, and she deserves to grow up without the shadow of what you did hanging over her. My husband has been her father since birth, in every way that matters. You contributed DNA, but that's all you'll ever be to her, a genetic footnote in someone else's family." She took a breath. "I hope you spend every day in prison thinking about the women you hurt, the lives you damaged, the families you affected. I hope you understand that you didn't just assault 4 women. You assaulted countless others who were too afraid to come forward, who blamed themselves, who carried your crimes in silence. And I hope someday Sophie asks about her biological father, so I can tell her that he was caught, prosecuted, and punished. That justice, even delayed, eventually came." The judge sentenced Thomas Wyatt to 28 years in prison, 7 years for each count served consecutively. He'd be eligible for parole in 18 years, meaning he'd be nearly 70 before he could walk free. Vanessa and I left the courthouse and sat in our car for a long time, neither of us speaking. We'd gotten justice, more than most assault survivors ever receive. But it didn't erase the trauma, didn't undo the conception, didn't change Sophie's genetic reality. We drove home and found Maya and Sophie playing in the backyard, watched over by Vanessa's sister who'd been babysitting. They ran to us when we arrived, asking if we'd brought them treats, completely unaware of the courthouse drama that had just concluded. Sophie climbed into my lap and asked what I'd been doing all day. I told her Mommy and I had been taking care of grown-up business, but everything was okay now. She accepted this and went back to playing, secure in a world where Daddy fixed problems and everything always worked out. That night, after the girls were asleep, Vanessa and I talked about when and how to tell Sophie the truth about her conception. Dr. Rosen, our therapist, had suggested waiting until she was old enough to understand complex concepts like assault, genetics, and chosen family. Maybe when she was a teenager, maybe when she took a biology class and learned about DNA. We had time to figure it out, time to find the right words, time to help her understand that she was loved, regardless of how she came into the world. For now, she was just Sophie, our daughter, loved completely by both of us. The genetic test that was meant to screen for cancer had instead revealed an assault, exposed a predator, and forced us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. But it had also strengthened our family, proven that love was stronger than biology, that fatherhood was defined by presence, not genetics. 3 years after that genetic counselor had dropped a bomb into our lives, Vanessa and I stood in our backyard watching Maya and Sophie play on their new swing set. They were 8 now, growing fast, asking questions about science and genetics they'd started learning in school. Soon they'd want to know about family trees and inherited traits, and we'd have to find ways to explain that sometimes families are more complicated than simple genetic diagrams. But today, they were just our daughters, both of them, equally loved. Sophie ran up asking me to push her on the swing, and I lifted her easily, my daughter who shared no DNA with me, but who was mine in every way that mattered. Vanessa watched us and smiled, and I saw in her face the same gratitude I felt. We'd survived something that destroyed most families. We'd turned our private nightmare into something that helped other women, that put a predator in prison, that maybe prevented future assaults. And we'd learned that family wasn't defined by genetics or biology, but by choice and love and showing up every single day, regardless of what complicated truths DNA might reveal. That was enough. That would always be enough, If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.